The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the streets of Detroit as Rebecca Williams parked her car in the lot adjacent to the Wayne County Municipal Court. Her hands gripped the steering wheel a moment longer than usual as she reviewed the details of her case. Representing marginalized clients was more than just a job for Rebecca. It was her calling. Today, she was defending Darius Taylor, a 17-year-old black high school senior accused of loitering outside a convenience store in his own neighborhood. The charge was absurd, and Rebecca knew it. Darius was not a troublemaker. He was an honors student, an active member of his church youth group, and a hopeful applicant for a full-ride scholarship to Michigan State University. But in this neighborhood, none of that mattered. To the patrolling officers, he was just another black boy standing outside a store. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from the thought of Darius's mother, Linda Taylor, a hard-working single mom who had begged Rebecca to take the case. "He's a good boy, Ms. Williams," Linda had said tearfully during their first meeting. "They're trying to ruin his future over nothing." Rebecca exited her car, briefcase in hand, and approached the courthouse. The weight of the case was heavy, but it wasn't unfamiliar. She had spent her career defending clients against systemic injustices. As she climbed the courthouse steps, she reminded herself of her motto, "Justice isn't served unless it's equal." The Wayne County Municipal Court was already bustling with activity. Inside, the hallways were lined with a mix of defendants, attorneys, and clerks. Rebecca scanned the crowd, noting the familiar imbalance she had grown accustomed to. Most of the defendants were black or brown, while the attorneys and court officials were overwhelmingly white. Rebecca entered the courtroom, her eyes immediately darting to the bench where Judge Harold Brighton presided. At 62 years old, Judge Brighton was a towering figure with graying hair and an air of authority. He was known for his efficiency, which many mistook for fairness. Rebecca, however, knew better. Over the years, she had observed patterns in his rulings, patterns that revealed biases he likely wasn't even aware of. She settled into a seat beside Darius, who looked small and nervous in his too-big suit jacket. His mother sat in the row behind them, wringing her hands anxiously. Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on Darius's shoulder. "We've got this," she said softly. As the proceedings began, Rebecca paid close attention. The first defendant was a young white man in a rumpled hoodie who strolled into the courtroom 15 minutes late. Judge Brighton barely looked up from his notes. "Try to be on time next time," he said, waving the man off with no fine. Rebecca's jaw tightened. Moments later, a Latina woman approached the bench, arriving less than 5 minutes late. "Ms. Garcia," Judge Brighton said sharply, his voice dripping with disapproval, "tardiness shows a lack of respect for this court. You're fined $250. The disparity was glaring, and Rebecca wasn't the only one who noticed. The bailiff, James Carter, a stoic black man who had worked in the courtroom for decades, shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca caught his eye, and he gave her a small, knowing nod. He had seen this play out too many times to count. Finally, Darius's name was called. Rebecca stood confidently, guiding her young client to the defense table. She placed her briefcase on the table, pulling out her carefully prepared documentation. "Good morning, Your Honor," she began, her tone professional but firm. "I represent Darius Taylor, who pleads not guilty to the charge of loitering." Judge Brighton barely glanced at her before turning his gaze to Darius. "Mr. Taylor," he said, "what were you doing outside that store?" Rebecca stepped in. "Your Honor, my client was waiting for his mother, who was inside the store at the time. We have surveillance footage to corroborate this." She handed a USB drive to the clerk, who plugged it into the courtroom monitor. The footage clearly showed Darius standing calmly near the store entrance, checking his phone occasionally. Moments later, Linda Taylor could be seen exiting the store with a bag of groceries and gesturing for Darius to follow her. "This footage," Rebecca continued, "proves that my client was not loitering in any disruptive manner. Furthermore, there was no posted signage prohibiting standing near the entrance." Judge Brighton frowned, leaning back in his chair. "Loitering is a subjective charge, Ms. Williams. The officers determined that Mr. Taylor's behavior was suspicious." Rebecca's voice remained steady, though her frustration was mounting. "With all due respect, Your Honor, suspicion is not evidence of wrongdoing. My client was merely waiting for his mother, as shown in the footage." Judge Brighton's eyes narrowed. "Loitering is loitering, Ms. Williams. This court fines the defendant $500. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Darius's face fell, and Linda covered her mouth, stifling a cry. Rebecca's pulse quickened, but she kept her composure. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now tinged with steel, "this fine is excessive and unjust. Given the evidence, there is no legal basis for a conviction." Judge Brighton leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Ms. Williams, are you questioning my judgment?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rebecca replied evenly. "I am questioning the application of justice when it appears to be inconsistent." The courtroom fell silent. All eyes were on Rebecca as she stood her ground. Even the clerk, Sandra Morales, paused her typing, her fingers hovering over the keys. Judge Brighton's face flushed red. "Ms. Williams, I will not tolerate such insolence in my courtroom. You are fined $1,000 for contempt." "Bailiff, escort her out." James Carter hesitated, his eyes betraying a flicker of sympathy as he stepped forward. Rebecca raised a hand. "It's all right," she said quietly, gathering her briefcase. She turned to Darius and Linda. "We're not done yet." As she walked past the rows of spectators, she held her head high. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Some were outraged by the judge's behavior. Others were inspired by Rebecca's bold stand. Outside the courtroom, Rebecca pulled out her phone and made a quick call to a reporter she trusted. "Karen," she said, "I have a story you'll want to hear." Unbeknownst to Judge Brighton, Rebecca's stand would soon become the catalyst for a citywide reckoning, exposing the inequities not just in his courtroom but in the justice system at large. That morning, the fight for justice had only just begun. Rebecca Williams stepped out of the courthouse into the brisk Detroit morning air, her mind racing. The sting of Judge Brighton's contempt fine still lingered, but it wasn't the money that bothered her, it was the principle. She had walked into the courtroom prepared to defend a young boy, but she had left with a deeper conviction. The fight wasn't just about Darius Taylor's innocence, it was about exposing a system designed to perpetuate inequality. Rebecca's phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen. It was Karen Davis, the reporter she had called earlier. "Rebecca, I just read through the summary you sent me," Karen said, her voice tinged with urgency. "This is huge. Racial disparities in sentencing, punitive fines, unequal treatment, it's all there. Are you willing to go public with this?" Rebecca hesitated. She knew the risks of speaking out. As a community lawyer, she was already fighting an uphill battle against a justice system stacked against her clients. Calling out systemic bias publicly could jeopardize future cases. But as she thought about Darius, about how easily the system could have derailed his future, her resolve hardened. "Yes," she said firmly. "This needs to be addressed." Karen promised to meet her later that day, but Rebecca's work wasn't done. She walked to a nearby coffee shop and pulled out her laptop. Using court records she had painstakingly gathered over the years, she compiled a list of cases where Judge Brighton's rulings showed clear disparities. For every white defendant let off with a warning, there were 2 black defendants fined heavily for minor infractions. For every white professional treated with respect, there was a black teenager humiliated in open court. Her list wasn't exhaustive, but it was enough to reveal a troubling pattern. By early afternoon, Karen's article, "A Broken System, Racial Bias in Detroit's Courts," hit the local news site. Within hours, the story began to spread. Social media lit up with posts tagged #JusticeForDarius and #EndBiasNow. People shared their own stories of discrimination in the legal system, and a groundswell of support for Rebecca's stand began to build. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Judge Brighton was oblivious to the firestorm brewing outside. He continued presiding over cases, unaware that Rebecca's confrontation had sparked a movement. Rebecca returned to her office to find her assistant, Trina, scrolling through Twitter. "You're trending, Rebecca," Trina said, half amazed, half concerned. "People are calling you a hero." Rebecca shook her head. "I'm not a hero. I'm just tired of watching this happen." Trina nodded. "What now?" Rebecca glanced at her growing pile of evidence. "Now," she said, "we organize. We need every story, every record, every shred of proof. This isn't just about Judge Brighton, it's about the entire system." Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from James Carter, the bailiff. You were right to speak up. Let me know how I can help. Rebecca smiled. The tide was turning. The fight had only just begun. By the next morning, Rebecca Williams's name was on everyone's lips. Local news stations picked up Karen Davis's article, and social media platforms were abuzz with stories from Detroit residents sharing their experiences in Wayne County Municipal Court. The hashtags #JusticeForDarius and #FixTheSystem trended nationwide, sparking discussions about racial disparities in the justice system. Rebecca, sitting at her desk, scrolled through her phone. The stories pouring in were heartbreaking yet familiar. A black single mother fined $1,000 for a late utility payment, while a white businessman received a deferred judgment for a larger amount. A teenage boy sentenced to community service for loitering, while a white girl in a similar situation was let off with a warning. Each story echoed Darius's experience and strengthened Rebecca's resolve. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from James Carter, the courthouse bailiff who had subtly supported her in Judge Brighton's courtroom. Attached was a document titled, Incidents of Concern. Rebecca opened it to find detailed notes James had been keeping for years: dates, cases, defendants, and Judge Brighton's rulings. These records are gold, Rebecca muttered, her heart racing. She called James immediately. I've been watching this for a long time, James said when he answered. I didn't have the power to speak up, but after what you did, I figured it was time to help. Rebecca thanked him, feeling a surge of gratitude. She quickly added James's notes to the growing pile of evidence on her desk. The pattern was undeniable. By afternoon, the momentum had grown. Karen called Rebecca with an update. The story's gone national, she said. I just got off the phone with CNN. They want an interview. Rebecca hesitated. The idea of stepping into the national spotlight was daunting. But then she thought of Darius and his mother, of James and the years of silent observation he had endured, and of the countless people who had been silenced by an unjust system. I'll do it, Rebecca said. Meanwhile, at Wayne County Municipal Court, the tension was palpable. Judge Harold Brighton had been notified of the media attention and the public outcry. As he presided over his cases, he could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him. Defendants, attorneys, and even his own clerk seemed more watchful than usual. For the first time in years, Judge Brighton was forced to consider the possibility that his rulings might not be as fair as he had always believed. That evening, Rebecca appeared on CNN. Sitting across from the anchor, she explained her decision to challenge Judge Brighton. This isn't about one judge, she said. It's about a system that consistently fails the people it's supposed to serve. It's time for accountability. Her words struck a chord. Across the country, people began organizing rallies and forums, demanding similar investigations into their local courts. Legal advocacy groups reached out, offering to help Rebecca compile and analyze the data she had collected. By the end of the day, Rebecca sat in her quiet office, exhausted but hopeful. She looked at the stack of evidence on her desk and the messages flooding her inbox. The fight was far from over, but the ripple effect had begun, and it was unstoppable. In the weeks following Rebecca Williams's stand, Wayne County began to see tangible reforms take shape. The media outcry and public pressure had forced the Wayne County Judicial Review Board to act swiftly. Judge Harold Brighton was placed under immediate investigation, with a detailed audit of his courtroom records spanning the past 5 years. The findings were damning: stark racial disparities in sentencing, excessive fines disproportionately affecting Black and Latino defendants, and a pattern of dismissive treatment toward minority litigants. Faced with mounting evidence and public backlash, Judge Brighton resigned from his position, citing personal reasons. Wayne County Municipal Court didn't stop there. Recognizing that the issue extended beyond a single judge, the court implemented sweeping changes. A new review board was established to monitor judicial decisions for racial and socio-economic biases. This independent committee included not only judges and attorneys but also community representatives, ensuring that the voices of those most affected by the system were heard. Mandatory bias training for all court personnel became a cornerstone of the reform. From clerks to bailiffs to judges, everyone who worked in the courthouse underwent rigorous workshops to recognize and combat implicit bias. These changes marked the beginning of a new era, one where justice wasn't just a word, but a principle actively pursued. Rebecca joined the newly established review board, bringing her first-hand experience and unwavering dedication to justice. She mentored young lawyers, teaching them how to challenge systemic bias. Her office became a hub for reform efforts, where legal professionals and activists collaborated to ensure the changes in Wayne County endured. Darius's $500 fine was overturned, and he received a public apology from the court. Inspired by Rebecca's advocacy, he pursued a law degree, determined to help others like himself. His story became a symbol of hope, proving that standing against injustice could lead to transformative change. 3 months after Rebecca Williams's bold stand in Wayne County Municipal Court, the city had transformed. The courthouse, once a symbol of inequity, now reflected hope and progress. A plaque in the lobby read, "Justice is not just the law, it's how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Rebecca's actions sparked nationwide reforms, inspiring similar investigations in courtrooms across the country. Law schools adopted new curriculum emphasizing ethics and bias, and community-led oversight boards became a standard for judicial accountability. Darius Taylor thrived, his once-threatened future now filled with promise. Inspired by Rebecca, he vowed to dedicate his life to ensuring others wouldn't face the same struggles. For Rebecca, the journey was far from over. But as she stood in her office, gazing at the framed receipt of her contempt fine, she knew she had started something bigger, a movement for true justice. Rebecca's courage sparked change, proving one voice can challenge injustice and inspire a movement. Let her story remind us of the power of standing up for what's right. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more inspiring tales of justice and resilience. Thank you for supporting this journey. Together, we make a difference.